Hi guys, welcome back to Reading with Teachers. I'm Mrs. Gilbert and we are back with Chapter 3 of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Here we go. Chapter 3, Looking Glass Insects. Of course, the first thing to do was look around the country she was going to travel through. It's like learning geography, thought Alice, as she stood on tiptoe in hopes of being able to see a little farther. She looked for rivers and mountains and towns and saw none. But then something caught Alice's eye. Why, what are those creatures making honey down there? They can't be bees. Nobody ever saw bees a mile off. And for some time she stood silent, watching one of them bustling about among the flowers, poking its long nose into them, just as if it were a regular bee, thought Alice. However, this was anything but a regular bee. In fact, it was an elephant, as Alice soon found out. And what enormous flowers they must be, was her next thought. What a large amount of honey they must make. I think I'll go down and... No, I won't go just yet. She went on, I think I'll go down the other way and perhaps I may visit the elephants later on. Besides, I do so want to get into the third square. So with this excuse, she ran down the hill and jumped over the first of the 6 little brooks. Tickets, please, said the guard, putting his head in at the window. In a moment, everybody was holding out a ticket. They were about the same size as the people and seemed to fill the carriage. Now then, show your ticket, child, the guard went on, looking at Alice, and a great many voices all said together, just like a chorus, Don't keep him waiting, child. Why, his time is worth £1,000 a minute. I'm afraid I haven't got one, Alice said in a frightened tone. There wasn't a ticket office where I came from. And again, the chorus of voices went on. There wasn't room for one where she came from. The land is there is worth £1,000 an inch. Don't make excuses, said the guard. You should have bought one from the engine driver. He stood there looking at her, first through a telescope, then through a microscope, and then through an opera glass. At last he said, You're traveling the wrong way, and shut up the window and went away. So young a child, said the gentleman sitting across from her. He was dressed in white paper. Ought to know which way she's going, even if she doesn't know her own name. A goat that was sitting next to the gentleman in white shut his eyes and said in a loud voice, She ought to know her way to the ticket office, even if she doesn't know her alphabet. There was a beetle sitting next to the goat, and he said, She'll have to go back from here as luggage. Alice couldn't see who was sitting beyond the beetle, but a hoarse voice spoke up next. Change engines, it said, and there it choked up. It sounds like a horse, Alice thought to herself, and an extremely small voice close to her ear said, You might make a joke on that. Something about horse on horse, you know. And after that, other voices went on saying what Alice ought to do. But the gentleman in white paper leaned forward and whispered in her ear, Never mind what they all say, my dear, but take a return ticket every time the train stops. I will not, Alice said rather impatiently. I don't belong to this railway at all. I was in some woods just now, and I wish I could get back there. You might make a joke on that, said the little voice close to her ear. Something about you would if you could, you know. Don't tease me so, said Alice, looking around to see where the voice came from. If you want to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself? The little voice sighed deeply. I know you are a friend, it said, a dear friend and an old friend, and you won't hurt me, though I am an insect. What kind of insect? Alice asked nervously. What she really wanted to know was whether it could sting or not. Wait, what? Then you don't, the little voice began, when it was drowned out by a shrill scream from the engine. Everybody jumped up in alarm. The horse looked out the window, then quietly said, "It's only a brook we have to jump over." No one seemed bothered by this, though Alice felt a little nervous at the idea of trains jumping. "But it will take us into the fourth square," she said to herself. She felt the carriage rise straight up into the air, and in her fright she caught at the nearest thing to her hand, which happened to be the goat's beard. But the beard seemed to melt away, and she found herself sitting quietly under a tree. The gnat, that was the insect she had been talking to, was balancing itself on a twig just over her head and fanning her with its wings. It certainly was a very large gnat, about the size of a chicken, Alice thought. Still, she wasn't nervous. They had been talking together so long. "Then you don't like all insects?" the gnat went on, as quietly as if nothing had happened. "I like them when they can talk," Alice said. "None of them ever talk where I come from." "What sort of insects do you rejoice in where you come from?" the gnat asked. "I don't rejoice in insects at all," Alice explained, "because I'm afraid of them, at least the large kinds. But I can tell you the names of some of them." "Do they answer to their names?" the gnat asked. "I never knew them to do it." "In the woods down there, they've got no names. However, go on with your list of insects. You're wasting time." "Well, there's the horsefly," Alice began, counting off the names on her fingers. "All right," said the gnat. "Halfway up that bush, you'll see a rocking horsefly if you look. It's made entirely of wood and moves around by swinging itself from branch to branch." "What does it eat?" Alice asked with great curiosity. "Sap and sawdust," said the gnat. "Go on with the list." Alice looked up at the rocking horsefly with great interest and made up her mind that it must have just been repainted. It looked so bright and sticky. "And there's the dragonfly," Alice said. "Look on the branch above your head," said the gnat, "and then you'll find the snapdragonfly. Its body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy." "And what does it eat?" "Frumenty and mince pie," the gnat replied, "and it makes its nest in a Christmas box." "And then there's the butterfly," Alice went on. "Crawling at your feet," said the gnat, "you may observe a bread and butterfly. Its wings are slices of bread and butter, its body is crust, and its head is a lump of sugar." "And what does it live on?" "Weak tea with cream in it." Alice was silent for a minute or two, thinking the gnat amused itself by humming around her head. At last it settled again and remarked, "I suppose you don't want to lose your name?" "No, indeed," Alice said a little anxiously. "And yet I don't know," the gnat went on, "how convenient it would be for you if you could manage to go home without it. For instance, if the nanny called you to do your lessons, she would call out, 'Come here,' and then she would pause, because there wouldn't be any name for her to call. And of course you wouldn't have to go, you know." "That would never do, I'm sure," said Alice. "The nanny would never think of excusing me from lessons like that. If she couldn't remember my name, she'd call me Miss." "Well, if she said Miss and didn't say anything more," the gnat said, "of course you'd miss your lessons." "That's a joke. I wish you'd made it." "Why do you wish I had made it?" Alice asked. "It's a very bad joke." "You should," but the gnat only sighed, and 2 large tears rolled down its cheeks. "You shouldn't make jokes," Alice said, "if it makes you so unhappy." Then came another little sad sigh, and this time the poor gnat really seemed to have sighed itself away, for when Alice looked up, there was nothing to be seen on the twig. So she got up and walked on. Soon she came to an open field with the woods on either side of it. It looked much darker than the last woods, and Alice felt a little nervous about going into it. But she made up her mind to go on. It was, after all, the only way to the 8th square. These must be the woods, she said to herself, where things have no names. I wonder what'll become of my name when I go in. I wouldn't like to lose it at all because they'd have to give me another, and it would be almost certain to be an ugly one. But it would be fun trying to find the creature that had got my old name. She reached the woods. It looked very cool and shady. Well, at least it's a great comfort, she said as she stepped under the trees after being so hot. To get into the what? She tried to go on, but she was unable to think of the word she needed. I mean, to get under this, you know, putting her hand on the trunk of the tree. What does it call itself, I wonder? I do believe it's got no name. Why, to be sure it hasn't. She stood silent for a minute, thinking, it really has happened after all, and now, who am I? I know it begins with an L. Just then a fawn came wandering by. It looked at Alice with its large, gentle eyes, but didn't seem at all frightened. She held out her hand and tried to stroke it, but it only stepped back a little, and then stood there looking at her again. What do you call yourself? The fawn said. I wish I knew, thought poor Alice. She answered, nothing, just now. Think again, it said. Alice thought, but nothing came of it. Please, would you tell me what you call yourself? She said timidly. I think that might help a little. I'll tell you if you'll move a little further on, the fawn said. I can't remember here. So they walked on together through the woods, Alice with her arms clasped lovingly around the soft neck of the fawn, until they came out into another open field. The fawn suddenly bounded into the air and shook itself free from Alice's arms. I'm a fawn, it cried out in a voice of delight, and dear me, you're a human child. A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and it darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry with having lost her dear little fellow traveler so suddenly. However, I know my name now, she said. Alice. It's Alice. I won't ever forget it again. Just in front of her, there were 2 signposts pointing the same way, one marked to Tweedledee's house, and the other to the house of Tweedledee. I said that wrong. Just in front of her, there were 2 signposts pointing the same way, one marked to Tweedledum's house, and the other to the house of Tweedledee. I do believe, said Alice, that they live in the same house. I'll just call and say, how do you do? And ask them the way out of the woods. If I could only get to the 8th square before it gets dark. So she wandered on, talking to herself as she went, until she turned a sharp corner and she came upon 2 little fat men so suddenly that she could not help but being startled. But she pulled herself together, feeling sure that they must be Chapter 4, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. That's next. Stay tuned. See you guys next time.